Just how far should the government go when it comes to trying to keep manufacturers in Australia and attract new ones? Given the global race that's underway to attract things like solar panel makers, battery makers and green steel makers. In a significant pre-budget speech this week, the Prime Minister has suggested the role of government needs to evolve as he flagged a much more interventionist approach under what he's calling a future made in Australia. The details at the moment are scant. There are some existing schemes that we rolled into this new act, this new law. We'll hear more in the budget next month, and we'll hear a lot more in the lead up to the election, which is expected to be in about 12 months from now. The government already has in place a number of schemes: solar, sunshot, hydrogen, Head Start, the critical minerals facility. This is about bringing those and more under the one umbrella. But why should Australian taxpayers be funding local production of things like solar panels? And how far do you go with this? Where does it end? Who deserves support? Who doesn't? That's what I'm keen to explore. Bran is the Chief Executive Officer of the Business Council of Australia. Bran, thanks very much for joining us on this chat.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So, look, in one sense, it's kind of no surprise that Australia is responding to the US Inflation Reduction Act. We've been waiting for some sort of response. We've seen other countries respond to this enormous effort by the Biden administration in the United States to try and attract more investment there. But in another sense, when you step back from it, it is quite a remarkable shift, isn't it? This return to more government intervention in the private sector. What do you make of it?
Well, it's such an interesting point, and you're absolutely right. We are seeing more countries take these strategic investments. The United States, with its IRA, has put in, I think, 500 billion Australian dollars towards incentivising the certain types of industries in its jurisdiction. We've seen the EU invest something in the order of 400 billion, the same in Saudi Arabia. I think Japan has put in 200 billion. So there is this sense that across the globe, governments are taking a more interventionist view. And our position has been that we need to respond. What our response looks like is the critical point, of course. And we've approached what the government's announced in the last 24 hours with what I describe as cautious optimism.
Well, perhaps if we take a step back, a fundamental question: why do we need to do anything here at all? What's wrong with buying solar panels or batteries from other countries?
Well, ultimately, it's about making sure that we've got industries that are sustainable in areas where we have advantages into the future. One of the things that we've been very clear on in terms of our own advocacy is the importance of trying to be strategic, and deeply so, in terms of understanding where those areas are. The UK, I think, set a good approach in this regard. They appointed an expert with a quintessentially English-sounding name, Lord Harrington of Watford, to undertake a review last year, and he produced what I think is a really interesting report, because what that spoke to is not just these are the industries that you should talk to in terms of where your investment might go, but how you go about making those decisions. And what he said is you've essentially got to approach the process of making investments at a national level in the same way that a private sector would. So look at what are the goals, where are the areas of strength, what do we hope to get out of the investment, and then you have a plan. Once you've identified the goals and the targets and the investment areas that are important, you have a plan that helps you deliver on those particular goals, and you orient government around those plans. So you structure government to make sure that you're delivering on what you regard as important, but it starts with that strategic sense of what is important. And I really want to emphasise that, because if you go in blind, then you are potentially throwing good money after bad.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, the government does have existing schemes out there for solar panels, for hydrogen, for critical minerals. But are they transparent enough? Just sticking with the point you've made there, is the government telling us through those schemes how it's deciding who's getting money and why and what the investment aims are?
Well, I think it goes back to that point in terms of if this is all going to be brought under the one umbrella, I would be encouraging a full review of where Australia is investing its funds. And I think there are a couple of key principles that you'd want to bear in mind there. The first is, don't invest in something that's never going to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, that's never going to be sustainable in and of its own right. I think the second is, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, don't invest in anything that can, on its own, entirely support itself. We shouldn't be putting taxpayer funds towards those types of initiatives.
So you've got to find that Goldilocks zone, really, haven't you?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But I think that goes to the point in terms of being very strategic in how you approach these things. And bear in mind, of course, that what the Prime Minister said yesterday is that ultimately these types of initiatives need to be private sector led. We completely agree with that. Government can't fund everything. It just, of course, doesn't have all of the resources at its disposal, but it can make strategic investments that help us support industries that might need a little bit of support to get started, and sustain industries where we think that there might be some sovereign capability that's important to the country.
So what about making solar panels here? Does that fall into the category of something we should be, or the government should be investing in?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. I think we need to look at that and see where the funds that the government's invested, how they are used, and ultimately what the success story looks like there. But I go back to the point: you don't want to invest in something that can't support itself. You don't want to invest in anything that's going to stand on its own 2 feet anyway. And I think the third point that I would make, which is most fundamental here, and this is what I hear from my members time and time and time again, it's not just about the money that government can provide. More important is making sure that the investment fundamentals are right. And what my members mean when they talk about investment fundamentals are the overall regulatory settings. So it's the industrial relations settings, the planning settings, the type of red tape and regulation that's applied to businesses across sectors, our jobs and skills environment, our taxation system. There's no one single lever, and I wish there was a big productivity lever that we can pull, but there's not. There's a whole series of different things that we need to do.
And I appreciate your point on the need for all of those things, but just to stick with where government should invest, and I promise I won't go through a whole list of areas, but battery making is the other big one that's talked about. And there's a lot of scepticism about whether Australia can or should really go down the path of trying to set up a battery making industry in Australia. The Prime Minister obviously thinks we can. We've got the critical minerals and so on. Why not make them here? What do you think?
Well, I would stress that point in terms of undertaking a review that gives us that evidence base. We shouldn't be making decisions in terms of investment in the absence of an evidence base. That's always our position.
Who should do that, the review, the evidence base?
So I think that there's a basis for taking a similar approach to what the UK has done, appoint an expert or a series of eminent people who have this type of expertise to help inform this new body. So that's why I say that we approach the announcement that's been made with cautious optimism. Optimism because we see that this is a reflection of the global environment and global trends, but caution because we've got to get it right. And there is enormous scope here for us to get it wrong if we simply impose more red tape, more layers of regulation to what is already a very heavily regulated investment environment. So if we can really sort of try and drive that type of analysis in order to inform investment decisions, that will set us in good stead.
If we can get that right, if we can get the right person or panel who can make that, review that, make the evidence, provide the evidence to support whatever government does. What about scale here? I mean, is there too much government intervention, or are you happy to see us really scale up in the way, well, perhaps not as far as the US has gone with its Inflation Reduction Act, but is there any point at which you think it's going to be too much?
We can never match what the US has done. I was in Washington just last year talking to a company that had been the beneficiary of a grant under the IRA, and they were talking about receiving $250 million and talking to US officials who were saying, is there any more that you need because we can provide that? The simple point is Australia can't compete on that level, and I've read with interest some calls from some commentators to provide a proportionate response. But I think the simple point there is that companies don't think in terms of proportions. They don't say, well, Australia's got a population that's 15 times smaller than the US, so I'll take a grant that's 15 times less than what I could get in the United States and stay here instead. So we need to be very mindful that cash incentives are but one lever, and that goes to my point in terms of making sure that the overarching regulatory environment is fit for purpose. And I really can't stress enough that the feedback that I get from my members is that increasingly, they are finding it harder and harder to justify investment decisions here in Australia. And that is of concern to us because we have been the lucky country. And I think we've got so many natural advantages at our disposal. We need to capitalise on them, but recognise that other countries are equally invested in making sure that their investment environment is as attractive as possible.
So this will be, we're told, a centrepiece of next month's budget. Just looking at what else you might like to see there, you've been calling for a return to, I guess, the old competition payments or productivity payments, you're calling them, to the states to, I guess, encourage them to lift their game. How would they work?
Well, that's absolutely right. We think that there is real merit in taking that style of approach. We saw in the 90s with competition reforms, as you've mentioned, that there were payments made to states in the order of about $5 billion, and that's translated into a year-on-year dividend for Australia of about $60 billion for our GDP. We'd like to see a similar approach taken where we can test particular initiatives, and the Productivity Commission would be, we think, well placed to do that, from states and territories so that they can be encouraged to undertake this type of productivity reform. It is hard for states and territories. They have smaller balance sheets. So to the extent that we can help push along reform initiatives where they might otherwise be hard, we think that would be really important.
And I guess how would you fund this? Could you, this perhaps a cheeky or political question, the GST top-up payments, the much bemoaned GST top-up payments to the states, could you rebadge those and say you get the money, but you've got to do all these other things to lift productivity in return?
That's exactly how we see it working in terms of the money being available in circumstances where the return was actually delivered. You wouldn't want to pay the money up front. You'd want to make sure that you were paying it after particular types of reforms had been commenced or indeed completed. And the ones that I'm talking about here, for example, ideally, we'd love to see the removal of payroll tax, but we appreciate that's very expensive. What you could do at the very least is have much more harmonisation across states and territories. You can start the incremental movement from stamp duty to a broad-based land tax within states and territories. And then, of course, there's incentivisation for the types of regulatory changes and planning changes that are necessary in order to give companies confidence to invest. And I might just touch very briefly, if I can, on payroll tax. This is quite extraordinary. If you look at the federal government's payroll tax website, it's got a really interesting page that speaks to the number of different payroll tax payments that are captured by different regimes across states and territories. And there are 39 different categories, but there are only 9 categories that have commonality across all states and territories. So if you're in the payroll division of a large company with national operations, or indeed in any company that's got an interstate presence or multiple state presence, then you're going to find it hard to figure out what you need to pay and what you don't need to pay. And of course, these things change. And then beyond that, you've got different rates of payroll tax across the different jurisdictions. So to say it's a nightmare, I think, is being polite. And it's that type of thing that we're focused on in terms of our advocacy on productivity payments.
Just a couple of other issues while I've got you there. Supermarkets. Look, this week we saw the Craig Emerson interim review, the former Labor Minister who the government's asked to have a look at the supermarkets. He's recommending making the voluntary code of conduct mandatory, some tough fines if there are breaches, try to empower the suppliers. Your organisation represents some of the big supermarkets. What do you think of this approach? And look, Craig Emerson has stopped short of the divestiture power that the Greens and even Peter Dutton is talking about, a breakup power. He says won't work. It might have the opposite effect.
So we were pleased that Dr. Emerson came to the same conclusion that we've been advocating for some time. The simple point is that we'd be concerned with any divestiture proposal based on the evidence that we've read and that the country has seen over the course of the last 30 years. In 2015, there was a review that said that these types of powers can be counterproductive because they can result in increased costs rather than reduced costs for consumers. They can imperil job security, and they might also have the effect of reducing competition. And that's, again, the conclusion that Dr. Emerson has come to. We were concerned a few weeks ago when the Greens brought forward a divestiture bill that was economy-wide and it also lacked quite a lot of detail. But we know from overseas experience that these types of powers can be very, very difficult And we've also seen, as I say, Australian reviews and Australian evidence bases that suggest that it's not the right path to go down.
Peter Dutton, for his part, though, has specifically talked about land banking by Coles and Woolies, where they buy a site but don't develop it just to keep it out of the hands of their competitors. Does that happen? Is that a problem?
Well, I'd say two things in that regard. First, I think we've seen that Coles and Woolies have their CEOs appearing before the Senate next week, so they'll be in a position to talk to their particular practices and their pricing structures and so forth. My view is always take a look at the evidence base, and they'll be providing their evidence that supports their positions at that particular point in time. But I'm also acutely conscious of the comments that have been made by Aldi's CEO in the very same Senate hearings overnight, and that is that the key issue in terms of stymieing development opportunities that ultimately bring about more competition is the sluggishness of state planning systems. Again, that takes us back to that point that I was making in terms of the importance of trying to incentivise states to take on really difficult productivity reform. And part of that is making planning systems more streamlined. If we can do that, then in this instance, that's a way of encouraging more competition within the sector.
A final one for you. You wrote an opinion piece this week warning that business is becoming a bit of a permanent punching bag in Australia. You wrote, "We are dangerously close to making it taboo to run a business well and turn a profit." Is it really surprising, though, that when people are struggling with cost of living, they see big corporate profits and they do get pretty angry at some businesses?
I completely understand that in times like this, and I know that we are in difficult times at the moment, it's only natural that people look to try and understand the causes of the hardship that they're feeling. And I think the unfortunate thing is that we've seen that the Greens and the unions particularly have been pushing this idea that big business is to blame for that hardship. And what we're saying is that's just not the case, and that it's so important that businesses do well. We've seen overseas what happens when businesses don't do well. You lose jobs, you lose opportunity, those opportunities go offshore. What we're saying is that we've got successful companies in Australia that are well managed, they're well structured, and they deliver dividends, they deliver jobs, they deliver taxes, and of course they support small business with that commercial exchange. That's so important to our way of life. It's ultimately what locks in our broader prosperity, and it's important that we realise that notwithstanding that everybody is doing it tough right now, it's that continued and ideally enhanced prosperity that is going to help us return to far easier times, we hope, into the future.
Bran Black, Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia, really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And good to talk about this future of manufacturing in Australia. We will have a lot more discussion on this on Sunday morning on Insiders. Hope you can join us then. Bye for now.
Making us all feel very excited about being here.